Conservatism is struggling because every institution in America is making it difficult to get the message out. They distort what we say. They apply double standards. And frequently, just silencing conservatives is the easiest way to deal with us. It's much harder to engage arguments. So, when we think about how we got here, I think people rightly understand that a lot of this happens as a result of what's happening in academia. But I also get a little frustrated when people say, like, how did things happen like this? I was talking with my dear colleague, Charles Krauthammer, many months ago, who was saying that, he's been in the punditry business for a really long time, and he's always been predicting doom and gloom if conservative values are not upheld. And he said after a while, he was wondering if maybe he wasn't being melodramatic, because it seemed like the country was doing fine. It was wealthy, healthy, people seemed to be largely content. And in recent years, he'd come to realize that, in fact, he had been right, that failure to uphold conservative values was having a serious problem for the culture, and that many of the predictions he'd made about moral rot were, in fact, coming true. I think conservatives should have far more confidence in their predictive powers. Frequently, conservatives predict some bad effect will come about with a change in policy. You can think of thousands of these examples, but think about how there were changes to welfare benefits decades ago, where, coming from a good place, people thought that it was unfair that women couldn't get welfare benefits for them and their children unless they were married. So they removed the requirement that you should be married if you're getting welfare benefits for your family. And conservatives said they understand why you would do that, but it might actually result in worse problems if the father is no longer considered integral to a family and he can just kind of check out. Of course, you can imagine what the response was to this line of argument. You people are evil, bigoted, racist. Is there nothing you wouldn't do to hurt poor people? And progressives won the day. Now, of course, we know that not only were the conservatives right, they were more right than they even knew. The situation in terms of family disintegration among lower classes is horrifically bad. Not having fathers involved in the raising of children is causing serious problems for young boys and girls, and we have now decades of data to show this. But there are no apologies offered for all those slurs that were hurled at conservatives. But never mind, my point is conservatives should have more confidence in their predictions. And for decades, conservatives have been warning about the decline of education in government primary schools, as well as in academia. They said it was causing serious problems, turning away from true education and adoption of many progressive ideas. Some have been warning about this at least since the 60s. And then they act surprised when they see what's happening on college campuses. And it is a bad situation right now, and I think it's worth going over a little bit of it. Over 90% of America's top colleges regulate campus free speech. 1/3 employ severely restrictive policies, according to FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, that monitors this. So one of the main ways that this can happen even is through policing of what are called microaggressions. This is where you say something nice, but the argument is that you're actually being racist or sexist. So if you say, I'm impressed that you're majoring in economics, to a woman like myself who majored in economics, that might be sexist because you're implying women can't handle the math. Well, that's silly, but at least you kind of understand what the thinking is there. Other examples are far less defensible, like if you say, America is a land of opportunity, that could be very hurtful to someone who hasn't made it to the top 1% of America. And supposedly this, marginalizes people who haven't had the same success as elites. The idea is completely out of control and infecting the larger popular culture. This week, there was a big brouhaha about The Simpsons, which is a show I don't watch, but my husband, I believe, has every episode memorized. And there is a character, Apu, who in my limited viewing, I believe is far and away the best character on The Simpsons. He runs the convenience store. He is fundamentally decent and honest and hardworking and nice. But a comedian just put out a documentary saying that he's problematic because he reinforces stereotypes about South Indian immigrants to the United States, which I would think, what is the stereotype that they're awesome because Apu is so awesome in this show? But people really decided that this was a real serious problem for The Simpsons. The Simpsons, to their credit, responded in their TV show by dismissing the criticism, which itself then was problematic because you're always supposed to respond to people with hurt feelings, by catering to those hurt feelings, and they declined to do that. But back on campus, a new Knight Gallup poll shows that 30% of college students favor outright censorship of politically incorrect views. And 30% is bad, but it's really bad when you realize that it was just 22% 8 years ago. Or sorry, just 22% 2 years ago. The William F. Buckley program at Yale recently commissioned a survey about attitudes toward free speech on campus. They interviewed 800 students all across the country, and they showed that by a margin of 51% to 36%, students favor their school having speech codes to regulate speech for students and faculty. 63% favor requiring professors to employ trigger warnings to alert students to material that might be discomforting. And I think that you're familiar with trigger warnings, and when it's discussed for people who have legitimate post-traumatic stress disorder, which usually arises from actual trauma, like serving in a war and seeing something really horrific and then struggling upon your return to a non-war society. And you can even argue that to some extent PTSD as diagnosed in the military is itself overly diagnosed, but the idea that being a freshman at Swarthmore requires a trigger warning, no matter how horrendous you think colleges are, I think that's a ridiculous claim to make. And 1/3 of students polled could not identify the First Amendment as the part of the Constitution that dealt with free speech. 35% said that the First Amendment does not protect something they call hate speech, while 30% of self-identified liberal students said the First Amendment is itself outdated. It's not a good situation. So it's a regular case to hear about conservatives, many of whom aren't even really that conservative, getting shouted down when trying to give a speech at a campus. And administrations aren't really doing much to protect these speakers, protect the rights of students who want to listen to these speakers. They're not really doing much at all, with a few notable exceptions. On which note, I get invited to speak at college campuses, and I have yet to be yelled at, and I feel like I'm doing something really wrong. So I'm going to work on that, see what I can do to improve the situation. But I think people need to focus on the bigger picture. Free speech isn't the end of itself. It exists for a much bigger, more important reason, and it's about intellectual freedom and the right of man to seek truth. And when you look at our First Amendment, the one that 30% of college students can't identify what's in it, it looks at so many of the freedoms necessary for man to pursue and identify truth. It is difficult to determine truth, and we need the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and most importantly, freedom of religion in order to pursue truth. The founders knew that was so important that this was built in at the very beginning, and a turn away from that very much hurts intellectual freedom. I was reading one scholar who put it well: shouting down a speaker robs listeners of the opportunity to hear and learn, and robs the speaker of his own speech. A central reason to value open debate is its capacity to show us the truth, even if only by voicing errors that make the truth easier to apprehend. Free speech is central to political and moral reasoning in which citizens express their conclusions and weigh them against competing claims. If you believe in self-government, you need free speech for an informed populace that makes wise and prudential decisions. And that does mean that provocative and controversial thinkers need space to express themselves and to be spoken against. When you look at the progressive agenda, which is for many about elite bureaucratic control of the people, control of the means of determining truth is key for advancing their agenda. Keeping people from being able to practice their religion for real is key to the progressive agenda. Limiting the press, such as we saw with that Citizens United battle, where the government tried to keep people from publishing negative information about Hillary Clinton. I think people forget the Citizens United ruling was really about whether you had the right to publish critical information, a critique of Hillary Clinton prior to an election in which she was running for office. And the government argued that you should not have the right to do that, which is just amazing. All that talk about microaggression, safe spaces, acquiescence to feelings, it isn't just the university's fault, by the way. It's also a result of the decline of family size and the resultant helicopter parenting that we've witnessed in recent decades, these bubbles of protection for students. But if you treat students like children, they'll act accordingly, and they do. You probably heard the story a couple years ago about how some office at Yale University's Intercultural Affairs Committee put out a memo asking people not to wear offensive Halloween costumes. Don't dress up as a Native American. You might offend a Native American. Don't dress up as a pirate. You know how pirates get. They're very sensitive. And this Yale faculty member named Erica Christakis sent an email in response which said, "Have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity, to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you?" It's a good question. She meant it actually rhetorically, but it turned out that they had lost faith in young people's capacity, and she and her husband, who are both working at the university, were bullied. She ended up being forced out of her job. The university did not punish the students who were screaming at her and her husband or bullying them. They, in fact, responded by allocating $50 million in diversity training or something to that effect. And my favorite thing is that Erica Christakis was called a housemaster, which is like a leadership position at Yale. They renamed the masters because they, of course, as you know, clearly it's a racist term. Unless you know Latin, even a little bit of Latin, where master comes from magister, meaning teacher. So they really showed the Latin people who's boss there. And of course, nobody knows Latin, so the only possible explanation for why you'd be called a master is racism. This other professor, William Deresiewicz, wrote a piece for the American Scholar about teaching at a woman's school recently where speech was stifled. He begins his piece by talking about a young student who says she quickly figured out that she had to hide her Christianity from students and faculty. And it really got him thinking about the climate at liberal universities. At one point, he notes that the schools are really religious institutions, not Methodist or Catholic, but that they are designed to protect the religion of the elite. Lost in this new higher education religion is inquiry into the fundamental human questions. What shall we do and how shall we live? Those questions threaten the radical individual success religion and its values, and they threaten the certain, confident orthodoxy of political correctness. The core purpose of a liberal education raises the possibility that there are different ways to think, and that is threatening to the progressive agenda. They have this idea: there is no need to debate or seek the truth or even compromise. Just crush the opposition and move on. And that is where we are now, and it's awful, and I think we should stop pretending it's not that bad. We should stop pretending it's acceptable. And as bad as things are now, yes, okay, great. As bad as things are now, people even 10 to 20 years ago, things were kind of bad on campus then too, but they were far more amenable to free speech at that time. So the decline is happening quickly, and I keep thinking, what's going to happen in 10 years when people come out of a climate in 10 years and they get control of all these institutions? It is going to be insanely awful even by today's standards. My colleague at the Federalist, Ben Domenech, wrote about this last week, saying, "Consider the major hires the Washington Post, New York Times, and the networks have made since the 2016 election. The additions overwhelmingly haven't been Trump fans. They have been different critics of the president and the administration, occasionally from a slightly more rightward position. Kevin Williamson was consistent with this. The point is that the audience, for all their airs about the diversity of viewpoints and how that's important, really just wants their existing views re-expressed to them in different forms and by different voices. If you get through the diversity veneer, you'll find the same rule: no wrong think can be tolerated. To these religious institutions of colleges and the media, constitutionalists and conservatives are abject heretics, and they treat us as such. It is time to stop trying to pretend that they are open to discourse, or that working with them is where you become like the one token person at their institution will affect the change that is necessary for the republic. For those with views placing them on the right, the only way to win, in my view, is to not play this game anymore. The only way to win is to build up our own platforms and institutions, our own Hillsdales, our own TV shows, our own publications. That's why my publication, The Federalist, exists. That's why Hillsdale exists. And I hope you all commit to recognizing the seriousness of the task ahead of us and the work needed to save the Republic and her values.